Thanks for staying with us. NUPR threatens to deny export permits over supply violations is what we're discussing right now. That means the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, NUPRC. It has issued a warning to exploration and production companies demanding strict adherence to their crude oil supply obligations, COSO, for local refineries. The Commission stated that any oil companies failing to meet their domestic supply commitments will face export permit denials for crude cargoes intended for export. This directive follows concerns raised by local refiners, including the Dangote refinery, about inadequate crude supply for domestic refining, which could impact Nigeria's energy security. NUPRC data shows that the Dangote refinery is expected to process 550,000 barrels per day, but sources at the refinery indicate that the government has not met the required crude supply, with suppliers demanding partial payments in foreign currency. The Commission reminded the companies that any changes to crude cargoes meant for domestic refineries must be approved by NUPRC's chief executive. In line with the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021, the NUPRC will enforce these regulations and penalize those who divert crude supplies for export instead of domestic use. A recent meeting involving over 50 key industry stakeholders revealed a blame game between refiners and producers. Refiners argue that producers preferred to sell crude abroad rather than meet domestic supply obligations, while producers claimed refiners often fail to meet operational terms. Both sides acknowledge the NUPRC's efforts to regulate compliance, but were reminded that any deviations from the agreed domestic crude supply obligations policy would require express approval from the Commission. The NUPRC emphasized that violations would no longer be tolerated as they threaten national energy security. Our guest this morning, we have on the one hand Nick Agule, an oil and gas expert, and also Olabode Showomi, the third, CEO Cap3. Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Tez.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin with
Good morning to our viewers.
Let's begin with Showomi this morning. The regulatory body is threatening fire and brimstone on whoever is making the supply of crude to Nigerian refineries or domestic supply to have a shortfall. What is your take on this threat and the solution so far that the NUPRC has brought to make sure this problem is solved?
Okay, thank you. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here. When it comes to these matters, first of all, even though it's a technical industry, this is a purely trade and regulatory matter. So in this case, you have a regulator who, to the best of my understanding, has issued certain circumstances who, to the best of my understanding, has issued certain conditions to the suppliers. And the suppliers in this case have been mandated to make supplies for domestic obligation. If those suppliers are not meeting the domestic supply obligation, then they are in violation of the regulation. However, it is a case of whether their production capacity is able to meet that supply obligation. Because don't forget that there's a percentage of that obligation. There's a percentage of what they produce that goes directly to Nigeria, which is NNPC, in the case of joint venture or production sharing contracts. So that's the first thing. So at the end of everything is about the details of the whole issue. Is what they are producing sufficient enough to be able to meet the domestic supply obligations when you look at their own other commitments to people they may have contracts with? That's the details that people need to find out.
Well, we didn't hear much about whether it is because they are not able to meet their production capacity or production what they were supposed to produce. Yes, obligations. We heard about the operational obligations that the refiners were not able to meet and all that. Maybe that is where that thing you're complaining about is embedded. But the complaint from refiners, one of them which worries me is, let me go to Chris right now. The complaint is that Nick. Why do I keep calling him Chris all the time? Let me go to Nick. The complaint, one of them was that they were requiring an upward payment in dollars. So does it mean that this naira to crude does not cover even other foreign companies? It is just a Nigerian thing, or are they also obligated to be paid in naira to make the process more seamless?
Thank you very much. Before I answer your question about the currency for the payment, I would like to stress that there is a nuanced difference in the Petroleum Industry Act between crude oil and gas domestic obligations. In the crude oil, it says that the Commission may issue regulations or guidelines on the mechanism for the imposition of a domestic crude oil supply obligation. For gas, it says the Commission shall, by a regulation or guideline under this act, prescribe and allocate the domestic gas supply obligation. In law, the difference between may and shall, as our viewers will note, is that the may is
Conditional.
not obligatory, right? Whereas the shall is compulsory. And I think the framers of the Petroleum Industry Act understood the differences between these two types of hydrocarbons, that is gas and crude oil. For gas, because you cannot store gas, you have to get the market for gas before you produce it. Because if you don't have that market, then you have to flare the gas. So that is why they would have made it mandatory for that. But for crude oil, you can of course store crude oil, and the framers also would have understood that, just like my co-panelist said, the crude producers today, they already had obligations, right? And crude contracts can be entered into for 5, 10, 20 years, right? Some of them even have their refineries abroad where they are feeding this thing. And so when the act was therefore framed, it said, it didn't say compulsory, meaning all other factors must be taken into consideration. Most of the big crude producers in Nigeria are in joint venture with the Nigerian government. For instance, I know for a fact that whatever Chevron produces, 60% belongs to the government of Nigeria. It's only 40% that belongs to Chevron. The same thing with Mobil. Same thing with Total. It's only the share one that is 55% to government. So all of those will have to be considered. And if there is capacity, then you will now say you will supply domestic refiners. Look, Dangote is looking for 550,000 barrels. That's a lot of production, right? Because at the end of the day, you discover that more than 50% of Nigeria's crude oil production is for the government of Nigeria. And if the NUPRC, which is a government agency, is looking for crude to give local refiners, it means that they can't even find crude in government owned allocations to be able to give to these refineries. So I think there's an issue there. So coming to the currency of payment, the Petroleum Industry Act says the payment can be in dollars or can be in naira or can be in baht. This is what the act says. And to be honest, if you want to produce crude oil, you are going to pick about 80% of your cost in dollars. Because if you want to start with even the seismic, where you do the exploration, to the drilling, you have to pay the rigs in dollars. You have to import everything in dollars. So after you now use dollars to produce the crude oil, and somebody pays you 100% in naira, what are you expected to do with the naira? How will you be able to offset your dollar bills? Except you now have to go to the foreign exchange market and start looking for dollars again. So at the end of the day, if Dangote is expecting that they will just pay naira only, and don't forget that Dangote will pay naira only, collect this crude oil, refine the crude oil, and part of Dangote's production, they are exporting it and collecting dollars. So is that fair? So you see, if we're interested in attracting investors to come to Nigeria, we need to be treating them fairly. Otherwise, others will just see it and they will just They will just
So
run away.
Nick, are you saying that it's okay to prioritize, foreign, foreign exporting because of better financial gains? I understand that they need the dollars, but is that what we should be doing? Not thinking of the shortfall that we have with our local refineries.
I didn't say that we should prioritize export of crude oil because of financial gain. I was talking about obligations that have already been entered into by the crude producers. A crude producer will not produce their crude and just keep it. They usually have markets, and these markets are long-term contracts. It is an industry I worked in for a long time. I know that for instance, I worked for IOC, two IOCs in Nigeria. I also worked for an OMA that was being run by an indigenous company in Nigeria. This indigenous company took loans to come and develop the oil field, and they were paying the loans with their crude oil, right? So now government now says oh, we have Dangote refinery now, you must give this crude oil to that refinery. The people that are expecting crude for their loans, they will come and liquidate this oil company for failing to pay the loans. So these are the kind of things that I'm talking about, and that is why even PIA itself does not make it mandatory that the NUPRC should make these obligations, right? Unlike gas, in the oil they said may, in gas they said shall.
Okay. Let me come to you, Shomi. I'm just wondering how long the arm of the NUPRC is to curb this, because if they are making pronouncements, how covered are they by law? How much can they go to make sure that this local supply is done, or are they just making pronouncements to make us think that they are working? Do they really have the power to control what they are trying to control?
Okay, first of all, NUPRC is a regulator. It is not a law enforcement agency. That needs to be fundamentally understood. Then secondly, just like the gentleman Nick was saying, there are some things about the industry that Nigerians, I would say, don't understand. It's more like don't want to understand and don't want to agree. Because first and fundamentally, like I said, is a market. It's a free market. Nigeria has, let's say, for the purposes of argument, we produce about 1.5 million barrels per day. Out of that 1.5 million barrels per day that we produce, the one that belongs to Nigeria, if we say 60%, based on what he has explained, we're looking at, say, maybe 900,000 barrels per day that goes to Nigeria. Out of that 900,000 barrels per day, maybe about 500,000 or so of it has gone into loans, forward sales that previous governments had entered into on behalf of Nigeria, and maybe some by this government as well. So government debt obligations take maybe about 500,000 of it. So you have 400,000 barrels remaining or thereabout. It is from there that they are going to run the economy. It is from there they are going to buy drugs. It is from there they are going to pay salaries. Where is Dangote's barrels going to come from? Now, when you leave the Nigerian aspect of it, then you go to the foreign people. Now, these foreign IOCs or those who produce, they have been producing for maybe 50 years. And they have contracts. Some of those contracts are like 20 years, some of them are 30 years. Are you saying that in order to make a certain new customer happy, they should violate the terms of the contract? Now, what that means is that they can be sued to court because you are violating a contract. And it also means that your credibility is going to fall very low and you will not be able to do further business with other people. The fact of the matter is this: crude oil can also be bought from these people, but it can be bought from them at prevailing market rate. The deal that Dangote has with respect to crude to Naira is with the federal government. And that deal did not promise them that all their demands will be met. What it just says is that the amount of crude that Nigeria can afford to give them will be given to them in Naira. And I think that needs to be understood. Because when we don't understand that, we are going to have entitlement mentality. We are going to have expectations that are not realistic. Like I said, the NUPRC is a regulator. If the regulator issues a regulation that those they are regulating with feels violates the act, they can be taken to court. So what they are going to do in terms of the pronouncements that we made is to ensure that the aspect of those crude production that belongs to Nigeria will be given to those people at the terms that the federal government has promised them. They are not able to do more than that.
Okay. So last Friday, which was the 31st of January, one of the headlines on the Daily Trust was low crude supply Mars Naira for crude scheme. And Dangote gets about 61,290 barrels per day for March as against 380,000 as mandated. So of course, if you look at the margin, is a whole lot. And I like the fact that you already explained what the Naira for crude is. So it's what we can give you, you pay in Naira. And if we do not have as much supply, that's it. But how do you think that, the government, because they're the ones who made this with Dangote, who have these agreements with Dangote, what policy do you think the government can put in place right now to even make it more attractive to the producers to say, okay, I want to sell to Dangote because I know I'm going to be making my money back?
Okay, so there is some part of it that is just market development. So when you have a market that is growing, say, for example, Ekene Dilichukwu at some point, they used to do Lagos to Kano, maybe in the 80s. And when they started, not everybody was flying that route. But they kept at it, they kept moving, then people knew them for it, and it became a profitable route. All those things are called market development. When you have a refinery that has the capacity that Dangote has, and they are not able to meet that demand in the initial, it is entrepreneurial capacity and entrepreneurial force that you use to develop that market. Some of those things, there are no policies that can change that. I mean, a football coach, no matter how good the coach is not going to play the ball for the players. The MD of your company, no matter how good he is not going to translate to best journalist for the TV station. There are certain things that are just market players that they must do. And we need to understand that and not equate everything to policy. Policies, whether policies, regulations, or laws, they are in the same category. They are just guidelines. The guidelines are not going to change the effort that the players need to develop the market. So those things should not be confused. So they can put any policies in place, but those policies are not to be there for them to be biased. Because Dangote is a market. It's not the only player. It's just a new player who has brought in disruption and who has brought in very good terms to the market. But he still needs other players for the market to be stable, for the market to be functional. So the laws must not favor one person. The laws must be even. The policies must be such that everybody can do their work, the industry grows, the competition is alive, and at the end, Nigeria benefits. That's the ultimate interest for all these policies.
So Nick, let's just continue with that and find out what we need to do, because at this point, it means that domestic supply, we are all agreed on that point, that it's not enough. And we also are agreed on the fact that you cannot impose on the people who may have had previous agreements that will not give them the opportunity to supply as much as we need. What are the things that Nigeria has to put in place now to make sure that we have the local supply? We are expecting more refineries, by the way. So how do we feed those refineries and the ones that are existing right now?
That's the issue. That the NPCL alone, the capacity of their own refineries is 445,000 barrels per day. And we hear that Boas 250,000 barrels is coming on stream soon. So if we have to say, what should we do? I think number one, let's do an inquest. Then number two, then we say, what's the way forward? Briefly, in terms of inquest, is that Dangote refinery must be told that they made a very big mistake. And this is where sometimes people who don't like buying Nigeria go and buy foreign, and they buy the one that is not as good as Nigeria's. I know that Dangote Refineries management is mostly Indian, right? Whereas you have competent Nigerian professionals who have worked in this industry for decades. Nobody starts a refinery project without first securing their source of crude. Nobody. That was a very big mistake that Dangote Refinery made. As at the point they were looking for land in Lekki to site that refinery was when they would have started looking for where they would get the crude. So that by the time the refinery is coming on stream, they already have secured their crude feedstock supply for maybe the next 10, 20 years. That didn't happen. They finished a refinery and then they are now hater-skater running around looking for where to buy crude oil. Who does that? For a 650,000 barrels refinery. So for those who are constructing refineries now, or who have the intention of doing so, we today on this show are saying, if you have not yet secured your crude feedstock supply, better go and start doing that now. Because if this conversation was happening about 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, even the Nigerian government could have started seeing where we can unlock production and be ready for Dangote refinery. And today we will not be having this conversation, right? Now, going forward, the truth of the matter is that going forward, Dangote refinery must accept the reality that for them to be able to operate a 650,000 barrels refinery in Nigeria, they must import crude oil from somewhere. And importing crude oil is not a crime. The United States, they produce like 13 million barrels of crude oil, crude oil. They have like 18 million barrels per day of refining. The United States is still buying crude oil from Nigeria, right? Despite the fact that they are producing 13 million barrels. So that you are importing crude oil doesn't mean it's a crime. And Dangote must get all their crude supply obligations in Nigeria. No, they don't have to. They will need to supplement the whatever is available locally with what is there in terms of import, and then it's for the government to take steps to ramp up production. Look, when I worked for IOCs in Nigeria, at a point Nigeria was producing 2.5 million barrels of crude oil per day. I was in that industry. So it means the capacity to produce it is still there. It only requires government to take certain steps. And that is why, for me, I'm so happy. And, on this show, we advised President Tinubu to look into the Ogoni matter. And look, Ogoni people are our friends. You should go and meet with them as a family so that we will unlock the hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude oil per day that are locked in Ogoni land. And then they take care of security and some of other things. We can bring more crude oil on stream so that the refineries will all be happy.
It's unfortunate that now that the president has approved a university or an environment there in the Niger Delta, people are suspicious that he just wants to unlock this thing, the crude oil you're talking about, without necessarily addressing the problems that led to the stoppage of drilling or exploration of oil in that in that region. So I don't know. Nigerians are suspicious of everything government does and all that. But we don't have much more time to talk about the matters that are here. We just know that these stories are developing stories. We'd like to know how it ends. We'd like to know what Nigeria would do to make sure that they have this domestic supply as much as possible. But we have to wrap it up at this point this morning. So we'd like to thank Olabode Shomi III, CEO Captree, and you, Nika Gule, oil and gas experts. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
We'll take a very short break now. When we return, we'll be looking at our second hot topic. Do stay with us.